Welcome to the Shrikecast. My name is Andrew Krauthamel, and before we get started today, I wanted to say hello to everyone in India. I was taking a look at the analytics information on YouTube for the videos, and noticed that about a quarter of all my views come from India, so hello to the other continent. Today I am on a TZ215W, W stands for wireless. Off of the live demo site. I really just jump around between the different models just to show you guys that it's pretty much the same on every model you go to, with the exception of some of the fancier NSA models. They have some additional features, but most of the stuff that I go over is the same across all the models. It's just the same firmware. So today we're going to be going over how to do load balancing failover, dual WAN, multiple internet connections, however you want to say it. Basically, how do you get two ISPs connected to your SonicWall and then have it intelligently switch between one or the other based on whether or not that internet connection is up or down. I saw this question come up recently on a help site online that I monitor, as well as some questions from other coworkers and people I've worked with over the past few weeks. So I figured I would go over how to do that today. If you're on an older device like TZ190, the last generation devices, you'll have a LAN with a couple port numbers and then your WAN and your opt ports. You can do this, although the interface looks different, you can do this in those devices as well. If you have the enhanced firmware, you can do WAN failover and load balancing it on the WAN and the opt ports. So this is applicable to that, but your interface is going to look different. So the first step to making this work is you're going to have the other ISP set up their modem or router, whatever they're terminating at, and then configure one of your available empty ports on your SonicWall for your static IP address, DHCP, PPPoE, however you need to negotiate an IP address with that ISP. You're going to have to put that into one of your empty ports here. One thing I should note is it makes a lot of sense to have two different ISPs. So if you have a cable company, it would probably make sense to have a DSL company as your backup. So you have a different connection method. If you are in a relatively moderate business, you might be interested in trying to determine an ISP that comes in from a different direction, down a different trunk line into your building. So if someone cuts the line at one side, you'll still have internet because not everything's channeled through that one connection up into your industrial park or whatever it might be. I've had that happen before. And I also like to try and mix the connection methods. Like I said, cable, mix it with DSL or mix it with fiber. And we try to use a different connectivity method. Having two cable companies or two DSL companies might not help you as much. If the phone lines go down, well, then the DSL goes down. So if you have two DSL companies, it's not going to do you all that much. So try and mix up your ISPs. If you're in the Northeast here, where I am, you have Comcast and Verizon or something like that. So, or if you have a business, you have Paytech or XO for a T1 or something like that. So what we'll do is we'll need to go into one of our available interfaces and configure for secondary internet. So remember that a SonicWall is a zone-based firewall, so we can assign it to the same zone as your normal internet connection, the WAN zone. So there's no reason to separate them unless you really, really want to. Keep them under the same zone, and then you can then choose the IP assignment for your internet connection. It's pretty basic stuff. You're probably already past this point since this is things you've done to get your SonicWall up and running already at this point. So let's say we have a static IP, and it's going to be, I've used this IP too many times, but alright, so there's my quote static IP for my connection, and then I have, a different mask or something. 1.1. There you go. So, and then maybe I want management, do some fun stuff. So then that's how we go ahead and configure it. One thing I like to mention is set a comment on your interfaces. This is something Cisco can do as well as many other vendors. Put a comment on your interface so you know what it is. So this might be the backup T1 line, something like that. If you go under Advanced, one thing I suggest, if you guys get, we'll have a video about this later, but if you end up wanting to do bandwidth management and quality of service and stuff like that, you would end up choosing the available bandwidth that you have purchased from your ISP under the port configuration here on the Advanced tab. So this is an important area to go to. You can also adjust your MTU. If it was a DSL line and you have PPPoE selected, it'll probably already adjust this for you automatically down to 1492. It might need to be less than that, so you'll have to do some testing on that. I might do a video about that in the future as well. If you have a static IP and it's not configured for PPPoE here, it won't automatically change your MTU, so you'll have to go in here and do this. This is important if you end up doing VPNs and such across your connection. Your packets will be larger than 1500 bytes and will end up having to be fragmented to go across the internet, which is not a very efficient way of doing things. So we'll have a video on MTU in the future. I'll do something about that. Again, you can also override your MAC address and stuff like that up here, and set your link speeds, and if you need to manually do that for your modem, whatever's in front requires. So there we go, we have basic setup. I have a second WAN, and I'd go ahead and click OK. So I'm on the live demo systems, so I can't save this. But if I go ahead and click OK, it would show up in there as a X2 WAN. You'd have an IP and a mask, and it would say hopefully there's a link if it's plugged into something out there. We would then go over to failover and load balancing. So normally this is disabled, and it would look similar to this. There'd be not much here. What you want to do is enable load balancing, and then you'll notice here if you expand this, you can select which interfaces go into your first load balancing group. So this is something relatively new in, I think it was like the 5.x release. They've added this grouping system for the load balancing, and it's pretty nice. You can create different, if you have a whole bunch of interfaces that you want to load balance in different ways, you can make different groups that are load balanced in different ways, and then have the different interfaces into each group. And you can get it pretty complicated if you really want. But most people, in the basic sense, they're just going to use the default load balancing group and add the interfaces in that they need. So by default, X1 is in there because that's our default WAN connection, as always. How do we add someone in there? We go ahead and we configure the group. So if we edit that group, over on the left here, we'll have some interfaces that we have configured on the network interfaces area but have not been added to the group yet. They'll show on the left here. So if you want to select them and add them to the group, you'll click on them and then click on the add button, and they'll move over to the right side. So here, if I were able to save the settings for X2 when I was configuring that, X2 would show up in here. And then I'd click it, click add, and then it would say X1, X2 as two lines. You can also select them here and adjust what the order is. So if you want X2 to be used first because it's a better connection, then you can do that. You can adjust the ordering, the preference of what interface is the default. There's also an option here to preempt and fail back to the preferred interfaces when possible. This allows it so that if you have X1 as your fastest, best, most expensive connection you want to use all the time, you'll want to use that as much as you can. So if that goes down and you fail over to your second connection, when it comes back up on X1, you're going to want to go back to it. So that's what that does. If you turn that off, it will fail over to X2 or whatever port you have configured, and then stay there until X2 fails, and then it will go back again. So a lot of people leave preempt turned on. The only problem you'll run into is if you have a bunch of VPN connections that you rely on for your business to operate, and if the internet provider keeps flapping up and down and keeps dropping and coming back and dropping and coming back, your VPNs are going to have to be renegotiating every time and coming up and down, and this thing's going to be changing the internet back and forth, and people are going to notice some problems. Weird things happen. So you might say, oh well, it might negotiate to the second IP on the remote side, but it should stay like that. But yeah, in theory, but I've seen weird things happen. So the only problem you'll run into with the preempt is if one of the internet providers flaps up and down all the time, that's going to be a hindrance to you. But all of this is based on using the type basic failover, essentially. you have some other options here. So this is what most people do that I deal with, is we'll have a primary internet connection and a backup internet connection. So using basic failover does what you would expect. You have your primary that's always on, and then when that dies, it will go to the secondary or the tertiary, or however many others you have selected here. So it'll just fail over and then go back to the primary once it comes back up. So the second connection never gets used unless you have specific routes that tell it to do so, or the first X1 connection goes down. You have some other options here. Round robin, you'll see that the checkbox went away because it's not applicable. If you have round robin, it'll just say, if you have two interfaces here, it'll say one connection goes out here, 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 and it'll just go left, right, up, down, up, down, up, down. Just going back and forth between the two interfaces or three interfaces that you have configured for your multiple internet connections. It does not take into account, fancy algorithm as to how much bandwidth on this connection or this one, and which one's better or faster. It's a very basic round robin. It's like doing round robin DNS. It just goes, here's an IP and here's an IP, left, right, left, right. It's a very, very basic load balancing system, but at least it uses some of the available bandwidth that's on your second internet connection. So people may see their internet speeds be faster if you have a fast enough internet plan. Also, if you were listening, you heard that I said it will say connection 1 goes here, connection 2 goes there. So the first connection would hit X1, the second connection would hit X2. The SonicWall is based on sessions, based on connections through the firewall. So when you are using TCP, for example, and you do that TCP three-way handshake and you create a session, you create a SOCKS connection, and you have, you've got an application, it's connecting, maybe it's Firefox or Internet Explorer, and it's going out to a website. That's going to create a session to transmit data across. The SonicWall takes those sessions and puts them on one interface or the other based on how you have this configured. It's not per packet. So if one session gets assigned to X1 and then they decide to download an enormous ISO of a bunch of DVDs for a Linux distribution or something, they could saturate all of the available bandwidth on that connection. But the SonicWall might not know that because it's just doing round robin. So then it keeps adding people to X2 and then X1 and X2 and X1. So then people that keep getting thrown onto X1 while this guy's using up all the bandwidth, their internet ends up becoming slower than the people who were lucky enough to be on X2. So there is that one downfall. It's not packet-based load balancing. It's session-based load balancing. So the only way to do packet-based is if you end up creating an autonomous system through your internet provider, and then you join them together with BGP to your ISP, and it gets complicated. So this is the easier method of programming and load balancing. So make note that that's the way it works. It's not per packet. It's not perfect. There are going to be times where you'd say, well, why was it slow? And it's probably due to something like that. It's not 100%. So we have some other types. We have spillover. So this kind of solves some of the issues I was talking about, where if bandwidth exceeds a certain amount on the first connection, it'll flow over to the secondary in a round robin manner. So that kind of takes some of the issues away that I was talking about, where a connection can be saturated and then everyone else gets the short end of the stick who's on that interface. This will try and resolve some of that for you. And then you also have ratio. So you can say, if you have two interfaces here, you can say 60% goes to X1 and 40% goes to X2, which is very handy because if you know that a certain amount of bandwidth is available on X1, you can put more of it towards that than X2, which might be a cheaper, slower internet connection with less bandwidth. One thing you'll probably want to turn on, though, in this situation is source and destination IP address binding. This makes the SonicWall take note and record what interface your session's going out and keep you on that interface for a while for that session. It doesn't move your session over to the other interface. This is important for when you're doing something with a secure sockets layer. If you're using HTTPS, SSH, anything like that where it cares what IP address you're coming from and you have a specific encrypted session, if you start magically appearing from a different IP address on X2, the session will be broken, it won't trust you. You'll have to renegotiate your connection. So if you're trying to do online banking or something like that, or any sort of secure website, you're going to want this turned on. It'll make your life a lot easier. So it'll keep your session on one interface or the other until it ends up closing. Once you send your FIN bits and the session closes, then you could go on either interface next time you reconnect and create a new session. So this is a very useful option, source and destination binding. So now that we've gone through the different types, we'll go to the probing tab. Here are the options for how it determines where to probe and how to probe and what it's going to do. So how it determines whether an internet connection is up or down is, by default, you have this option here to ping the SonicWall responder servers, which SonicWall maintains and runs for us to make our lives nice and easy. We can probe this on a specific port number. I believe it used to be like 50,000 or something like that. It'll do that every 5 seconds, and then it will deactivate after 6 intervals. So after 30 seconds, it'll switch over. And then after an interface comes up and it probes another 3 times on that same interface, it'll then reactivate it and potentially flip back to that if you have preempt turned on, if you're doing basic failover. So that's basically how this works. So you can adjust this. If you want it to deactivate an interface after 2 missed intervals, and you want the intervals to be every 2 seconds, you could do something like that. So it would be a lot faster of a switchover. But you might have more false positives. You might be flipping over to your backup connection unnecessarily. So the default settings are usually fine unless you have a very particular client, someone who's very needy. 30 seconds really is not the end of the world. Most people won't even notice. You can make it less though. So if you want it 15 seconds or something like that, you can do that. If you click on the configure button for an interface underneath the group there, you can change where the probes go to. This is, if you guys are on the older SonicWalls, the Gen 4s, this is pretty much what you'll see under the probing area. It'll be blue with their different interface, but this is the old interface basically, is where it would have the responder.sonicwall.com host in here, and it used like TCP port 50,000 or whatever it was. Or you can configure it to do ping to a certain IP address. This is where you can change basically where it probes to. So instead of probing through the group to that default responder.sonicwall address, you can go into each interface and then define different IPs to ping. You can have it ping or do a TCP connection on a certain port number to your default gateway for your ISP for each individual interface if you wanted to. I almost never go in and do this. There's little reason. The SonicWall responders are pretty good. I think they went down actually since I said that. I think they went down the overnight like a few days ago or a week ago or something like that. But that was the first time in years that I've seen anything wrong with those responder servers. So most likely you won't have to go in here, but it is here if you want to change things. If you want to override and use your own little probing system, you have your own servers you want to try and hit across the internet to probe. So once you go in and configure that, just again make sure enable load balancing is checked, and then you just go ahead and click accept, and your load balancing will be enabled. And then every 5 seconds, if you have kept the defaults, it will probe each interface. It'll give you statistics down here for your load balancing group at the bottom, tell you what it's doing. So every 5 seconds it'll do probing to the SonicWall responder servers. And then after 6 failures, it'll eventually flip over and consider that a bad interface and tell it to deactivate. And then after 3, it'll come back up again. So if you left your defaults, it'll probe both interfaces to the same address, that responder server, every 5 seconds. If something does go wrong and it does flip over to your load balancing, and you end up using the failover feature, you can go in and check the category WAN availability, which is usually what I use, that'll tell you whether or not an interface goes up or down. Make sure I didn't miss anything in here. Yeah. I normally go in and just use WAN availability, and most often it'll show up as yellow lines as well. It'll say X1 went down, X2 went down, X1 is back up, and it'll give you information about that. And I believe that is it for load balancing and failover. With the newer SonicWalls, the Gen 5s and the latest firmwares, which I think it was like 5.3 or something like that. It's probably wrong, but I think it was somewhere around there. They added the ability to do multiple interfaces rather than just two. So on pretty much every SonicWall model in the new generation devices, you can do as many as you have ports for. So I could turn all 6 of these ports, minus X0, all 5 of these ports actually, into additional WANs, and then I could put them all into load balancing groups and do all sorts of fun stuff. So you have no limitations as to how many you can do. It's really just based on how many physical ports you have on the model you purchased. So that's a real handy thing. And I believe that's about it for today. So if you enjoyed it, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for those who have done so. If you enjoy this information, check out andrewkrauthamel.com. It's a blog that I run for networking and security info. And StrikeTools.com, which is a managed security solutions provider for small and medium businesses. And I will see you guys next Wednesday. Thank you.